In 1998, beneath the aging floors of the St. Martin Parish Courthouse, archivists uncovered records that were never meant to be found. Hidden away for more than a century were baptismal ledgers from 7 plantations along Bayou Shore, documents that contradicted everything Louisiana's elite families claimed about their past. The records listed more than 200 enslaved men, women, and children bearing surnames reserved for the most powerful white Creole dynasties in the state. Duperre, Beaumont, Dessau, names that granted instant access in New Orleans salons, commanded respect in Baton Rouge, and occupied seats in the state legislature. Yet there they were written in fading ink beside the word slave. Next to auction values. Next to notes describing bodies, scars, and skin tones. When copies of these records reached the Louisiana Historical Society, the response was immediate. 3 prominent families filed legal injunctions demanding the documents be sealed. Their attorneys argued privacy violations. They dismissed the entries as clerical mistakes, historical inaccuracies, the careless work of illiterate record keepers. But the genealogists who examined the ledgers before they vanished understood the truth was far darker and far more deliberate. These pages didn't reveal an error, they exposed a secret Louisiana's plantation aristocracy had spent generations erasing. Before we continue with what those records ultimately uncovered, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications if you're drawn to hidden histories that challenge everything we think we know about the past. And tell me where you're listening from, or drop your city or state in the comments. These stories span centuries, but they connect us here and now, because what was discovered along Bayou Teche would eventually tie together 3 families, 5 plantations, and a carefully maintained conspiracy of silence, one that endured for nearly 200 years. And now, it's time to uncover it. Martin Parish in the 1840s existed in a world of its own making. The bayou country of Louisiana was different from the cotton kingdoms of Mississippi or the tobacco estates of Virginia. Here, the old French and Spanish colonial systems had left their mark in ways that made the social structure more complex, more nuanced, and infinitely more fragile than outsiders understood. The Acadian settlers, the French Creoles, the Spanish merchants, the free people of color who owned property and businesses, all created a society with layers that didn't exist elsewhere in the South. Bayou Teche wound through the parish like a dark ribbon, its waters reflecting cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, its banks lined with sugar plantations that made fortunes during harvest season. The air hung thick with moisture 9 months of the year, carrying the sweet smell of sugarcane during grinding season and the earthy scent of the swamp during summer. This was a place where French was spoken as often as English, where Catholic feast days dictated the rhythm of life as much as planting seasons, where old colonial laws sometimes still held more weight than the newer American statutes. The Dessau plantation sat on a particularly prosperous stretch of bayou. 3,000 acres of primed sugarcane land that produced enough hogsheads each season to keep the family in their New Orleans townhouse through the social season. Emile Denoy had inherited the property from his father, who'd received it through his mother's family line connecting back to the original French land grants. Emile considered himself a modern planter, educated at the College of New Orleans, well-traveled, a subscriber to agricultural journals from as far as Cuba and Brazil. He kept meticulous records, believed in the latest innovations in sugar processing, and prided himself on running an efficient, profitable operation. His nearest neighbors were the Beaumont family to the north and the Duperre family to the south. All 3 families moved in the same social circles in New Orleans. Their wives served on the same charity boards. Their children attended the same private emis. During the summer months when fever season made the bayou country dangerous, these families retreated to their city homes and attended the same dinner parties, the same theater performances, the same requiem masses at the St. Louis Cathedral. But in St. Martin Parish, in the records kept in plantation offices and parish courthouses, something strange was happening. Something that none of these families ever discussed, even among themselves. On the Denoy plantation, there lived an enslaved man named Jean-Baptiste Denoy. He'd been born on the property in 1814, the son of Marie Desoy, who'd been born there in 1789. On the Beaumont plantation, records showed an entire family, Pierre Beaumont, his wife Catherine, and their 5 children, all enslaved, all carrying the Beaumont name through 3 generations. The Dupree plantation had even more. 12 people across 2 family lines, all documented as slaves, all bearing the surname Dupree in the baptismal records kept by the parish priest. Father Rousseau, who served street, mart and church, kept these records faithfully. He baptized enslaved infants with their full names, recorded marriages, noted deaths. He never questioned the surnames, never asked why enslaved people carried the names of the families who claimed to own them. Perhaps he assumed these were the results of informal marriages between planters and enslaved women, a common enough occurrence, though rarely acknowledged in polite society. Perhaps he thought it was merely local custom, or perhaps he knew exactly what those names meant and chose to keep his silence. The enslaved community knew. They understood the meaning behind those surnames, passed them down with careful intention, taught their children the significance of carrying names that made the white families uncomfortable. On Sunday afternoons, when enslaved people from different plantations gathered during their rare free time, the Disnoy would find the Beaumonts, the Dupree would seek out the Landerer and the Thibodeaus, other plantation families whose names appeared both in the big houses and in the quarters. In the Disnoy family quarters, Jean-Baptiste lived with his wife Marguerite and their 3 children. He worked as the plantation's head cooper, a skilled position that kept him essential to the operation. During grinding season, every hogshead of sugar needed barrels, and Jean-Baptiste could craft them faster and better than anyone in the parish. He'd learned the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father. The Disnoy family, the enslaved Disnoy, had been coopers for 3 generations, their skills passed down as carefully as their surname. Jean-Baptiste was a careful man. He moved through his work with quiet precision, never drew attention to himself, taught his sons the same caution, but he also taught them to remember. Remember the stories passed down from the old ones. Remember the names. Remember that the surname they carried meant something more than the plantation owners wanted anyone to know. Émile Disnoy knew about Jean-Baptiste. Of course, it was impossible not to know. They shared the same surname, lived on the same property, saw each other almost daily during harvest season. But Émile had perfected the art of not noticing. He would call Jean-Baptiste by his first name only, would refer to him in correspondence as the cooper or the skilled barrel maker. In the plantation ledgers, Jean-Baptiste appeared as Jean-Baptiste Cooper with no surname listed, despite the fact that the parish church records clearly showed him as Jean-Baptiste Disnoy. This elaborate pretense extended across all the plantation families. At social gatherings in New Orleans, if anyone mentioned the strange circumstance of enslaved people bearing French family names, the subject would be politely redirected. A curiosity of the old colonial system. Someone might say, merely the priests being overzealous in their record-keeping. Another would add, the conversation would move on to safer topics. Sugar prices, the latest fashions from Paris, politics in Washington. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, something was building. The enslaved families with French surnames knew their history in ways the white families desperately wanted forgotten. They kept their own records, their own stories, passing them down through oral tradition with the kind of precision that comes from knowing such stories are dangerous to tell but too important to lose. The disruption came from an unexpected source. On a humid morning in June 1847, a young lawyer from Massachusetts arrived in St. Martinville, the parish seat. His name was Charles Porter, and he'd been sent by an abolitionist society in Boston to investigate rumors about Louisiana's free people of color losing their freedom through fraudulent legal proceedings. Porter was 26, earnest, and dangerously naive about the complexity of Louisiana society. He'd set up temporary residence at the modest hotel in town and began his work by reviewing public records at the courthouse. This was legal. Louisiana law allowed examination of property deeds, court proceedings, and parish records. Porter spent his first week copying deed transfers, looking for evidence of free people being illegally enslaved. What he found instead was something he hadn't expected. The baptismal and marriage records showed a pattern that made no sense to his northern sensibilities. Enslaved people with surnames, not just any surnames, but names that matched the prominent families whose plantations he'd passed on his journey from New Orleans. Porter, trained in Massachusetts law, where such things didn't happen, assumed he'd found evidence of a massive fraud. He theorized that free people of color were being illegally held as slaves, their freedom papers destroyed, their status changed through corruption. He was wrong, but his mistake would set off a crisis that the plantation families had avoided for generations. Porter began interviewing the free people of color in Street Martinville, showing them the records he'd copied, asking if they knew the enslaved individuals with these surnames. The free Creole community, who understood the delicate racial and social dynamics far better than Porter ever could, grew nervous. They gave him evasive answers, suggested he might be misunderstanding the local customs, recommended he speak with the parish priest for clarification. Father Russo received Porter in the church rectory with polite weariness. When Porter spread his copied records on the table and began asking about the enslaved Beaumonts and Dupera, the priest's face remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Reporter, you must understand that Louisiana is not Massachusetts," Father Russo said in his accented English. "Our history is more complicated than you might imagine." "But, Father, these records show enslaved people with the same names as the families who own them. In some cases, these families have existed for 3, even 4 generations. Doesn't this indicate that these people should be free? That they're being held illegally?" Father Russo chose his words carefully. "The church records what is presented to us. We baptize children with the names their parents provide. We do not inquire into legal status that is not our domain." Porter wasn't satisfied. He pressed further, asking why the church would help perpetuate such obvious injustice. Father Russo's expression hardened slightly. "Young man, I would suggest you are making assumptions about matters you do not fully understand. Perhaps it would be wise to conclude your business here and return to Boston." But Porter didn't leave. Instead, he began visiting the plantations, requesting to speak with the enslaved people whose names appeared in the church records. This was his crucial mistake. Plantation owners in Louisiana had broad authority over their properties, and they didn't take kindly to Northern abolitionists attempting to interview their enslaved workforce. Emile Denoyer received Porter's visiting card at his plantation office on a Thursday afternoon. The card was formal, proper, requesting an appointment to discuss certain parish records pertaining to persons on the Denoyer property. Emile read it 3 times, his jaw tightening with each reading. Then he sent his overseer to town with urgent messages to the Beaumont and Dupera families and to 3 other plantation owners whose names appeared in Porter's copied records. That evening, 6 plantation owners gathered in Emile's study, a room lined with ledgers and agricultural journals smelling of tobacco and brandy. None of them sat. They stood around Emile's desk reading Porter's card, discussing in rapid French what the young lawyer might have discovered and what needed to be done. "He thinks he's found illegally enslaved free people," Jacques Dupre said. "He doesn't understand what he's really seeing." "Then we must ensure he continues not to understand," replied Francois Beaumont. "We've maintained this arrangement for 50 years. We cannot allow some idealistic fool from Massachusetts to destroy what our families have carefully preserved." The arrangement. None of them wanted to say it explicitly even here, even among themselves. But they all knew what those surnames meant, why they'd allowed those names to persist in the quarters while carefully erasing them from public documentation, why the enslaved families clung to those names with such determination. Emile made the decision. "We inform the sheriff that Porter has been trespassing, attempting to incite unrest among the enslaved population. We request that he be escorted to the parish boundary and warned not to return. The records he's copied are public, but his interpretation is dangerously incorrect and potentially inflammatory." "The sheriff will understand." Francois nodded slowly. "And the records themselves, the church records?" "Father Russo keeps those as he always has, their internal church documents. But perhaps we suggest that future entries might be less specific about surnames. For clarity's sake, the other men agreed. They'd learned long ago that the best way to keep a secret was to hide it in plain sight while ensuring no one looked too closely or asked the wrong questions. Sheriff LeBlanc escorted Charles Porter to the parish boundary 3 days later. The conversation was polite but firm. Porter's investigations were creating unrest. His misunderstanding of Louisiana law was potentially dangerous, and for his own safety, the sheriff emphasized this part carefully. It would be best if he continued his work elsewhere. Porter argued, threatened to write to his abolitionist society in Boston, insisted he'd found evidence of systematic legal violations. The sheriff listened patiently, then pointed to the road leading east toward Mississippi. Porter left, but not before sending a lengthy report to Boston, complete with copied parish records and his theory about illegally enslaved free people. The Abolitionist Society published portions of his report in their newspaper, though the story gained little traction among Northern readers who were already convinced that Southern slavery was fundamentally unjust. Porter's specific claims about surnames seemed like a minor detail in a system entirely predicated on injustice. In St. Martin Parish, life returned to its careful equilibrium. The plantation owners relaxed. Porter had been dealt with. His misunderstandings would fade into the background noise of abolitionist propaganda, and the particular secret of those surnames remained safely hidden beneath his incorrect interpretation. But something had shifted in the quarters. The enslaved families with French surnames now knew that their names had drawn outside attention, that someone had noticed what the plantation owners pretended not to see. Jean-Baptiste Denoy had heard about Porter's visit from other enslaved people who worked in town. He'd heard that Porter had been asking questions about the Doy name, about baptismal records, about freedom papers. On a Sunday afternoon, when the enslaved people from neighboring plantations gathered near the bayou during their free time, Jean-Baptiste met with Pierre Beaumont and Louis Dupré. These three men, heads of their respective families, made it their business to know what was happening across the plantation district. They sat on logs beneath cypress trees, fishing poles in hand as cover for their real purpose, conversation away from white oversight. The Boston man thought we should be free, Louis said quietly. He thought the names meant we had freedom papers that were taken from us. Pierre shook his head. He understood nothing. The names mean something, but not what he thought. Jean-Baptiste watched his fishing line drift in the dark water. My grandfather told me stories before he died. He said, we carried these names for a reason. But he never said why we weren't to speak of it directly. Only that we must remember. We must pass the names down and we must wait. Wait for what? Louis asked. He didn't say, or perhaps he didn't know himself. He'd heard it from his father who'd heard it from his mother back to the old times. The French times before Louisiana was sold to the Americans. This was the mystery that lived at the heart of the enslaved families with French surnames. They knew the names were significant. They knew they were supposed to preserve them, pass them down, remember, but the reason why had been lost in the passage of years, in the careful oral tradition that sometimes lost details, even as it preserved the essential core. The older generation, those who'd been born in the 1780s and 1790s, had whispered things before they died. Stories about the old colonial system, about different laws that existed before the Americans came, about promises made and then forgotten when power changed hands. But these stories were fragmentary, confused by time and trauma mixed with the kind of hopeful thinking that oppressed people sometimes needed to survive. What Jean-Baptiste and the others didn't know, what had been deliberately obscured by the plantation families for 2 generations, was that their surnames weren't accidents of colonial record-keeping or the results of informal relationships. The names carried a legal significance that had once been recognized under French and Spanish colonial law, a significance that the plantation families had spent decades ensuring remained buried and forgotten. The years passed. Porter never returned to Louisiana, though his report occasionally resurfaced in abolitionist publications. The plantation families continued their careful pretense, erasing surnames from their private records while allowing them to persist in church documents that few people outside the parish ever examined. Life in St. Martin Parish followed its predictable rhythm of planting and harvest, of summers in New Orleans and winters on the bayou, of births and deaths, and the slow accumulation of profit from sugar. But as the 1850s progressed, the political situation changed in ways that made the plantation families increasingly nervous. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national politics. The Compromise of 1850 had briefly calmed tensions, but by 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had reignited them. Louisiana's plantation owners watched the national debates with growing unease, understanding that their entire social and economic system might be approaching a crisis point. In 1856, something happened that would eventually force the secret of the surnames into partial light. Emile de Noyer's eldest son, Philippe, returned from studying law in Paris. Philippe was 23, sophisticated, full of European ideas about rational governance and modern legal systems. His father had sent him to Paris partially for education, but also to make connections with French merchants who bought Louisiana sugar. Philippe had succeeded on both counts, but he'd also developed something his father hadn't anticipated, a genuine interest in legal history and colonial law. Philippe spent his first weeks back in Louisiana, reacquainting himself with the plantation, reviewing his father's records, and organizing the somewhat chaotic family archives that stretched back to the original French land grants. He worked in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house, surrounded by ledgers and deed books and correspondence going back 70 years. On a humid afternoon in July, Philippe discovered a metal-strong box in the back of a cabinet that stored the oldest documents. The box was locked, but the key hung on a nail nearby, suggesting it had been forgotten rather than hidden. Inside, Philippe found a collection of documents from the 1780s and 1790s written in French, dealing with colonial legal matters that seemed to predate Louisiana's transfer to the United States. Most were routine property transfers, dowry agreements, commercial contracts. But one document dated 1791 made Philippe pause. It was a formal legal instrument called a manumission paper granting freedom to a woman named Marie, described as muleteers of the Disnoy household. The document was signed by Philippe's great-great-grandfather Echine Dessoir and countersigned by a Spanish colonial official. Spain had controlled Louisiana during that period, but this manumission paper had never been filed with the colonial authorities. Philippe knew enough about colonial law to recognize the significance of that. For a manumission to be legally valid, it had to be registered with the Spanish Cabildo in New Orleans. This one showed no evidence of ever having been filed. Instead, someone had kept it in a strong box for 65 years. Philippe continued reading. The document stated that Marie's children, born or to be born, would inherit her free status. It recognized her existing children. We've maintained peace for decades by not challenging those stories, but also not acknowledging them. You'd be wise to do the same. Victor returned to the Disnoy plantation unsatisfied, but warned. He didn't change the record-keeping policy, but he also didn't press the issue further. The surnames remained in the ledgers, and Jean-Baptiste returned to his work, knowing he'd taken a risk, but uncertain whether it had accomplished anything. The collapse of the Confederacy came rapidly in Louisiana. In April 1863, Union forces secured control of the entire Mississippi River after the siege of Vicksburg. St. Martin Parish found itself surrounded by Union-occupied territory. Confederate authority became nominal, then non-existent. By June 1863, Union troops arrived in St. Martinville and the enslaved people of the parish began claiming their freedom. The transition was chaotic. Some plantation owners tried to maintain control, offering wages to convince newly freed people to stay. Others simply abandoned their properties and retreated to Texas or Mexico. The freed people faced immediate questions: where to go, how to survive without the resources that enslavement had simultaneously denied and provided, how to navigate a freedom that came with no land, no money, and no infrastructure to support it. For Jean-Baptiste de Noyer and his family, the moment came on a hot morning in June when Union soldiers arrived at the plantation. The officer in charge, a captain from Ohio named Miller, informed Victor Pigeon that all enslaved persons on the property were now free under military order. Victor could offer wages if he wanted workers to stay, but he had no authority to keep anyone against their will. Jean-Baptiste gathered his extended family that afternoon beneath the oak trees near the quarters. 3 generations of de Noy, Jean-Baptiste and his wife, their 5 adult children and their families, and 8 grandchildren. Also present were members of the Beaumont and Dupre families who'd come from neighboring plantations with the same questions. "What now?" "We're free," Antoine said, Jean-Baptiste's oldest son. "That's what matters. We can leave, go to New Orleans, claim land under the Union programs we've heard about." "Free with what?" asked one of the Beaumont men. "We've got no money, no resources." "And our names?" He paused, looked around at the gathered families. "Our names are still their names. How are we going to use them?" This was the question that had been inevitable once freedom came. The surnames that had preserved a hidden history during slavery would become a source of confusion, suspicion, and even danger in freedom. A black man named Desnoer in Reconstruction Louisiana would immediately raise questions about his relationship to the white Desnoer family. The same would apply to the Beaumonts, Dupre, and others. Jean-Baptiste spoke carefully. "We keep the names. The names are ours. We earned them through generations of carrying them. Whatever the truth is about the old papers, the old laws, the names belong to us now." "The white families won't like it," someone said. "The white families have pretended not to notice us for 70 years. Jean-Baptiste replied, "They can continue pretending, but we don't change our names to make them comfortable." This decision, replicated across multiple families in the parish, created an unusual situation. As St. Martin Parish began registering freed people during Reconstruction, the records showed dozens of black families with prominent French surnames. The white families who shared those surnames reacted with varying degrees of denial, outrage, and confusion. Some tried to force newly freed people to change their names. Others simply refused to acknowledge the existence of black Beaumonts or black Dupre. But the freed people maintained their names. They registered them with the Freedmen's Bureau, used them when claiming property, taught them to their children. The names were their connection to a past that slavery had tried to erase, even if the full truth of that past remained hidden in locked strong boxes and buried memories. The crisis of the surnames reached its peak in November 1863 when Philippe Duy finally returned from France. He'd been unable to get back to Louisiana during the war, but once Union forces controlled New Orleans, he managed passage on a French merchant vessel. He arrived at the plantation to find it operating under Union supervision. His cousin Victor having fled to Texas and Jean-Baptiste de Noyer supervising the former quarters as an unofficial leader of the freed community. Philippe and Jean-Baptiste finally met properly for the first time. They sat on the porch of the plantation office. Jean-Baptiste no longer had to stand hat in hand before a white man's desk. Philippe had brought with him the strong box. He'd retrieved it from its hiding place, had carried it to France and back, had spent 7 years trying to decide what should be done about it. "I found these papers in 1856, Philippe said, opening the box. "They're manumission documents from the 1790s. If they'd been properly filed, your great-great-grandfather would have been free, which means you should have been born free." Jean-Baptiste looked at the documents at the old French script he couldn't read. "My grandfather told stories," he said. "There were papers that our name meant something. I never knew if the stories were true or just hope dressed up as history. They were true. Your family should have been free for 70 years. My family prevented that by not registering these papers when Louisiana transferred to American control. We profited from your labor for generations when we had no legal right to do so." Jean-Baptiste was silent for a long moment, looking at papers that represented a stolen inheritance of freedom. Then he said, Can they be filed now? Would they make any difference? Philip had consulted with lawyers in New Orleans before coming to St. Martin Parish. The Emancipation Proclamation freed you regardless of these papers, but yes, I believe they should be filed. They're evidence of a historical wrong, and they establish your family's legal right to the denoyer name through blood and colonial law, not just through the tradition you've maintained. Why are you telling me this? Why give me these papers? Because it's the truth. Because my family owes your family a debt we can never fully repay. And because you preserved the names when you had every reason to give up on them. That perseverance deserves to know it was justified. Phipe filed the manumission papers with the Fruery Edmonds Bureau and the Louisiana civil authorities. He also provided depositions about his family's decision not to honor them, about the systematic concealment that had lasted decades. The filing created a minor scandal in New Orleans legal circles. Here was a white plantation owner admitting that his family had illegally enslaved people who should have been free under colonial law. But the larger significance was soon buried under the chaos of Reconstruction. Louisiana in the 1860s and 1870s was consumed by political violence, economic collapse, and the struggle over black civil rights. The specific case of the Desoy manumission papers became one detail among thousands of legal complications emerging from slavery's end. What mattered to the freed families in St. Martin Parish was simpler. They had their names. They had evidence that those names represented something real, and they would continue to carry them into freedom. The freed families with French surnames scattered across Louisiana and beyond during Reconstruction. Some stayed in St. Martin Parish, working as paid laborers or sharecroppers on the same plantations where they'd been enslaved. Others moved to New Orleans, where they joined the complex community of free people of color and newly freed people trying to build lives in an urban economy. Still others migrated north or west, carrying their surnames to Chicago,